Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This week, we're continuing a two-part series. This is part 2 of a series talking about respecting our 10-year-old, or what's technically called our tertiary, cognitive function in our personality. On the last episode, we talked about the 4 judging functions at the 10-year-old position. And in this episode, we're going to cover the 4 perceiving functions at the 10-year-old or tertiary position.
Right. And last time we discussed not just our respect for that 10-year-old or tertiary position, but also some of the virtues that are within the grasp of those judging functions, meaning that obviously anybody of any type can develop any virtue, but each of the judging functions has an accessibility to certain virtues or things it values. But we're going to talk about the perceiving functions, which are a little less associated with this idea of virtue. Because the perceiving functions are more about basically information, right? They don't have a hierarchy of things that they're evaluating. They're not making should statements about the world. And so virtue is a little more removed from these functions. So I like to think of this as less about virtue as it is more about the accessibility to wisdom. So we've done podcasts before on a model called DIKW, which stands for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And that is a progression of the value of information, basically. Data just simply means random pieces of information. You could see it as almost like the ones and zeros of the world. But when we organize that information together and understand its meaning, then now we have a more sophisticated version of this called information. And information is what the meaning of this data is. Once we apply this information, then we move into a place of knowledge, and that is basically applied information. It's how this information interacts with reality and the outside world. It's a lot more about sort of a way to take this information and make it useful to us. And then once we do that for a while, once we've implemented knowledge, eventually it becomes wisdom. And for me, wisdom is best understood by knowing what rules can be broken, right? When you get good enough at something, when you've learned it well and you've come to a place of mastery or wisdom around it, you start to realize maybe these rules aren't really rules. Maybe they're contextual. Maybe it sort of depends on the situation. Maybe in this situation, I need to follow the rules, but in other situations, I can, it would be better not to follow the rules so much. And so wisdom is not just understanding how you can apply information, it's contextualizing it to the situation.
So you're telling me when I run a stop sign in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m, that's wisdom, basically.
I guess you could say that as long as there's no policeman around.
I'm just kidding. I don't run stop signs. Done it 3 times in my life.
Yeah. Well, wisdom would also say that if there's a policeman around that catches you.
Or a camera.
Or a camera, right? Maybe that's one of those that always needs to be observed. So yeah, wisdom is being seasoned, right? And so when it comes to the perceiving functions, when we show respect with that tertiary or 10-year-old position for that function, it's not simply getting all the virtues out of it like it would be with the judging functions. It's actually more about trying to understand the wisdom these functions bring. Now, you're never going to have a level of wisdom as somebody who has the same perceiving function as their dominant or driver, or even as a co-pilot or auxiliary. Because a part of the reason why they have access to greater wisdom with these functions is that they're using them all the time. When you are applying certain things, right, when you're using them constantly, you get to see this particular thing in a myriad of contexts and a myriad of situations. When it's our driver or dominant function, we're always trying to force it to be the right tool for the job, and oftentimes it's not. And so you start to really get into an idea of its limitations, how it can be creatively used. You get to see a very fleshed out experience of this function. As a 10-year-old or tertiary, you might not be able to access that as much because you're not using it constantly or all the time. You're using it just when you need to use it or when it serves you to use it. And so a respect for this position might be to understand what's its underlying wisdom attempting to get to. What is the purpose of this perceiving function? Why are we using it ever? What is the wisdom it has to bring to the world? So whether or not we have the capacity to tap into that level of wisdom, if we understand its underlying purpose in existing, we can have greater access to it when part of the blind spots or the parts of this function that aren't so easy for us, when we start to understand what it's trying to accomplish, we can tap into that energy a little bit more, tap into that purpose a little bit more, and observe when these limitations are happening. Because when it comes to the 10-year-old or tertiary, sometimes it's not a matter of just building the skill into this virtuoso level, which we don't really want to do anyway. That would be way too much competition with our co-pilot or auxiliary, which is a much healthier place for us to be. But sometimes we don't really understand the limitations that we have with these functions. And just an awareness can bring a lot of wisdom in and of itself. The moments we go, this is not the right tool for the job, even though this is a comfort zone for us, or even though this is something that I want to go to because it reinforces a worldview, maybe I need to kind of back up a little bit and go to a co-pilot or auxiliary function instead. Using these functions in the 10-year-old or tertiary in a way that best suits us for our type, by tapping into that underlying wisdom, is a way, as we mentioned last week, to get as much juice out of that fruit, right? When we're squeezing it, to get the best amount of juice for us, to get the highest leverage for our relationship with this function.
So let's start with the two intuitive functions. We can start with introverted intuition. We've nicknamed this perspective. It's the 10-year-old or tertiary of all ISPs. So ISTPs and ISFPs will all use this as their 10-year-old process.
All two of them.
I meant all of them in the world, but
right.
Yes, all two types as well. But yes, all of the millions of ISFPs and ISTPs in the world.
Oh, that's funny. I honestly, that's of course that's what you meant. My introverted thinker was like, what does he mean all? That's what you meant. That makes sense. All right, so let's talk about introverted intuition or perspectives as a 10-year-old or tertiary. What is this function's purpose? Why does it even exist? And how can we respect its purpose? Well, one of the things that introverted intuition or perspectives does is it helps us understand implications, consequences for actions, and it helps us get into the fundamental truth that everybody is experiencing their own reality. Now, when you go into this function, no matter who's using it, regardless of your type, one of the things it does for us is it gives us a rich inner world. It's like bringing the outside world and textures that we experience in the outer world and tapping into our inner interpretation of that, replicating worlds inside of ourselves. And in some ways, these worlds inside of ourselves are sometimes more real than the world outside of ourselves. Now, those of us, the personality types that don't really have a lot of access to this function, it can get hazy when we go internal. Sometimes we don't go into this world of imagination and this world building. We sometimes struggle to really understand it. But anybody who has it as a function in their stack or their car model, they really tap into this. Even if it's an inferior or 3-year-old function, they really tap into this idea of the rich inner world that they're experiencing almost as real as the outer world when they're visiting this part of who they are. And one of the traps that an ISP can fall into is believing this inner world is just as real as the outer world. And in a way where a person who's an ISP might think that they've experienced something simply because they imagined it, because they fantasized about it internally. If they're not careful, if they over-rely on the 10-year-old or tertiary or don't respect its underlying message that everybody has this and that there's a way of bringing this inner world understanding to the outer world, if they instead have the outer world serving this part of who they are, they can fall into a trap of their fantasy world being more real to them, thinking they experienced something that they didn't experience because they felt it inside. And unfortunately, that's not respecting the purpose of this function, which is about implications and recognizing that everybody has an inner world interpretation of what's going on. Everybody's experiencing something just a little different. By believing that your inner world is the world and projecting that onto other people, sometimes an ISP can unfortunately project that imagination or those fantasies onto other people and believe that they know the reality of a situation when they actually haven't tapped into it at all. They haven't tapped into the reality at all. They've simply imagined it internally, and now that becomes how reality works. And so unfortunately, it sort of loops back in on itself. This ability to understand inner world realities, the ability to understand personal meaning and implication, can get too personalized. It can be in a place where they don't get that the purpose of this is to go, oh, if I'm doing this, other people are doing this too. And that there's a variety of these, and then it's about reconciling that variety. That's really what its purpose is. But over-identifying with it, unfortunately, loops back on itself, and then it cuts off the experience that other people have, their own implications running at the same time.
I think because it's always combined with an introverted judging process of either introverted thinking for the ISTPs or introverted feeling for the ISFPs, what ends up happening is you have a personal evaluative criteria around this perspective that you form. And I think because the tertiary 10-year-old introverted intuition or perspectives is just not as sophisticated, it believes that other people are applying the same judgment to that as well, like a very similar judgment to how you would be judging it. And so not only are you overvaluing your own perspective, but you're also pulling in the judgment and maybe overvaluing how other people will be judging it. So now they're doing stuff that looks baffling to you from your perspective, and it's hard for you to say, oh, they're even judging this different. They're not only seeing it different, but they're also judging it different. And both of those things are now hard to get a hold of because you're able to reconfigure how you see something using this 10-year-old so well. You can kind of cast it forth or project outward a reality that's so real to you. You forget it's not just the perception, it's also the judgment.
Yeah, so this is kind of complicated to understand.
It's a little abstract.
Yeah, I mean, after I got done saying everything I was saying and what you just said, I realized that it's kind of hard to sort of grasp how this works. And I think at the end of the day, basically what we're saying is that your ability to shift perspectives, to understand that there are patterns running inside of your mind, that there are realities that you experience, unfortunately can sometimes, as opposed to being something that truly shifts into another person's experience, you take what your experience is and you project it onto the other person. Like you overvalue your experience of introverted intuition or perspectives. And your world, your inner world becomes the only world. When really the purpose of this function is to remind us that everybody has an inner world going on. Everybody has one of these. And so if you don't allow yourself to respect the purpose of the process, then it becomes too insular. It becomes too much about your version of this as opposed to everybody's version. And one of the challenges of just intuition in general, we talk a little bit about this with extroverted intuition in a moment, but one of the challenges of intuition at a 10-year-old or tertiary position is that we sometimes don't know who we can trust or not trust when it comes to the information in this position. Actually, it's not just intuition. Now that I think about it, it's literally any function in a 10-year-old or tertiary position. We're not 100% sure who we can be trusting when it comes to this function, meaning that let's say that you have a thinking function as your 10-year-old or tertiary. We talked about this last week. Sometimes you're not sure whose information is you're properly vetting. Like take, for example, introverted thinking that IFJs use. Can I trust this person's information? I haven't been scanning for that. So when they give me a piece of information that contradicts with what makes sense to me, can I trust that? And what ends up happening is this inability to know when you can and cannot trust somebody else means that in some ways you're almost vulnerable to other people. And so in an effort to defend ourselves against those vulnerabilities, we get skeptical. We're not sure who we can trust, so we just don't trust anybody. Because oftentimes when we're younger, we trust everybody. We overly trust other people. The same thing with feeling functions. If you are a person who has a feeling function as your 10-year-old or tertiary, you are in some ways vulnerable to other people's emotional expressions. And that can, over time, like there are moments when that will be exploitative, like you'll be manipulated by others. And so what happens is you're overly accommodating or overly open. And then over time, if that has created pain or caused really bad situations, then you clamp down. You don't trust anybody. And that will happen with intuition as a 10-year-old or tertiary as well. You're not sure whose intuition or patterns you can trust. And so if you aren't careful, you can become skeptical and don't trust anybody's patterns except for your own. And when it comes to introverted intuition, this is why it can become something that you project onto other people as opposed to have them report to you what their inner world is. because you don't know whose patterns you can trust. This is one of the reasons why paranoia can sometimes come into this position, or a skepticism about things like psychology, or a skepticism about, anything that feels a little too woo-woo. It's because you're not sure if you can trust those. Maybe early on in your life, you were too open and accommodating to them, and that ended up creating a mess.
I think just a final note of how this might also show up. I always look at introverted intuition or perspectives as like the Nostradamus function that can look into the future. And I think when it's down in the CAR model, the cognitive function stack, it tends to create self-fulfilling prophecies. So it projects what it thinks will happen in the future, and then it actually creates that reality because it wants to match it. So your brain sees something that might be a possibility. Instead of it just being a possibility, it becomes a probability because you're going to drive all your cognition and your energies and everything you're seeing and doing toward this inevitable thing you're seeing in the future, right? But how much of that are you creating as an ISP?
Yeah, so I think the underlying purpose, again, going back to the purpose of this function, is to understand implications and consequences. And sometimes that can actually get in the way of an ISP in some ways, because not only can you project your reality onto other people, have self-fulfilling prophecies like you just mentioned, Joel, but also sometimes you can portend bad things even though you have no evidence of them becoming bad. It can actually strip your bravery from you. For ISPs, of course, the developmental leverage point is extroverted sensing, which is their co-pilot or auxiliary sensation, which is a get into action function. It's about making things happen, getting into action, not hanging back. But when you see implications and consequences in long timelines and you trust your pattern, you trust that, I'm seeing the future, I'm seeing how it's going to end up, but you might not be seeing a long enough timeline or going enough further into the future. You might just be seeing like a shorter timeline, and that could be bad, and you get a little paranoid around that. Sometimes it can cause an ISP to not act. But the understanding and awareness that there are implications in timelines, and if you use that to support your extroverted sensing or sensation, it means that when you go do things that are active, take action, be brave, that there'll be a part of you that can kind of predict what's going on tactically as you're moving through the world. It can assist you in becoming a not somebody who doesn't move, that stops themselves or prevents themselves from doing things, but as you're moving and as you're moving through the world and taking action, it can assist you in taking the right action. So understanding that it's about implications, but making the timeline a little shorter, not making it something that's like, oh, I have to think about everybody's opinion on this, or I have to think about how everybody's seeing this, or I can't take any action because it's all going to turn out bad. That's not leveraging this function. Leveraging this function is understanding that as you're moving through the world, this part of you will be an assistant to you. This will help you move through the world with a little bit more savvy. Again, not prevent you, but be an assistant as you're moving through the world. And so there's a certain respect you need to have for its purpose in existing, but you don't want to be a captive to it. You don't want it to stop you from doing things. You want it to help guide and assist you as you're doing things.
Let's move over to the other intuitive process that is at the 10-year-old tertiary level. This is extroverted intuition. We've nicknamed it exploration. This is used by all ESJs in the Myers-Briggs system. So ESFJs and ESTJs use this function at the 10-year-old position.
So extroverted intuition or exploration's purpose in existing is, just like any function, it's multifaceted. And one of the things that it helps us do is understand how new experiences change us as people. It can also be about things like disruptive technologies. It can be about novelty seeking. There's a lot of things that come in here. But respecting its purpose in existing is recognizing that when we don't experience new things, we stagnate as people. We don't go for, something that might be bigger than whatever we're currently experiencing. We don't reach out for things that are bold. There's a bravery that comes along with this function, just like with extroverted sensing, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's a boldness for something outside of our frame of reference. And that's its purpose in existing. Its purpose in existing is forcing us out of our comfort zones and to experience something bigger. And when we do that, or when somebody who has this as a 10-year-old or tertiary does that, it means that they won't get too locked into the trap of simply novelty seeking, just wanting to have something new, over diversifying, doing a whole bunch of stuff just because you're bored. That's something that is very much a trap for people who have this as a 10-year-old or tertiary, just wanting to get a quick hit of novelty. And it can turn into overconsumption of, like stuff, basically. It can turn into, doing too much new buying or diversifying in projects, opening new loops before closing other ones, or maybe having too many relationships, too many friends, and not really being able to manage them all, or develop really good, intimate relationships because you're trying to manage all of these just sort of more shallow connections. And that's not really showing a respect for the purpose of it, which is these new experiences need to be changing you as a person. That's its point. And so when somebody has this as a 10-year-old or tertiary, as opposed to just wanting to own something new, they'll more be thinking about trying something new, doing and being something new, trying to see who they can become. It's more of like a bigger picture. It's more of like when I do this thing, I can feel myself growing into it. It's getting me out of my comfort zone. It's not simply doing something new for its own sake, but it's doing something new so that I can grow into this new thing as well. It should be about changing who you are, not just changing your environment or owning more or having almost like a gluttonous experience. And I don't mean gluttonous with just food. I mean like gluttony for life, never being satisfied, always thinking the grass is greener on the other side. That's really the trap of this. And when you don't have a respect for its purpose, which is not to pine for something that you want, but become something that you would like to become, settling into a something bigger than who you thought you could be. You're the greener grass because you've gone out and done all the things you needed to do to become the greener grass. And so I think it's sometimes challenging when when a person has this as a 10-year-old or tertiary in just wanting these quick hits, recognizing that this is not meant to be a quick hit. It's meant to be something that helps create stronger roots.
We call it exploration for a reason. It's about exploring possibilities and new connections between things. So seeing things that already are and finding ways they combine or connect. What would happen if we combine these disparate things together? What kind of alchemy could we create? It's exploring the world with this framework of, if I push this over here, what moves over on this side? We didn't call it novelty. We called it exploration. But novelty is part of this. To explore, you have to do new and novel things. But pursuing novelty for its own sake, that's going to end up, again, getting one-sided around this and not respecting the function's intent. And just those new hits of whatever that novelty might be, that's something that it can create a trap, really, for the person that doesn't respect this at the 10-year-old position. We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision-making. But a quick warning. We are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
Again, we're talking about going from like data and information to knowledge and wisdom. And you might never have the same level of understanding that concept of, getting outside of your comfort zone and how it changes you in a way that a person who has this as a driver or co-pilot, that might just be a bridge too far to be constantly and perpetually changing, because you need more integration time. in order to understand how it changes you, you need a little bit more time and space between these new experiences. And that's perfectly fine, but recognizing that that's its purpose. Its ultimate purpose is to have these moments when you get to meet yourself in this new situation for the first time. You get to meet this, how you rise to these occasions. And if you just fall into the overconsumption trap, if you fall into the novelty trap, you don't get to meet a new self. You just meet a new object, or you meet a new thing or new person. If you let yourself really build on those novelties, if you meet a new person and then form a relationship and forge a bond with them and understand who they are over time, then that person has the ability to change you, has an ability to impact who you are. But then that means that you need to really recognize the purpose of this function, not just meet new people, but have these new people help you understand who you are, and as a reflection of the relationship, or a new project, or a new situation that requires you to be bigger than yourself. Recognizing that that's its purpose leads to more wisdom, right? It leads to more understanding of who you truly are, and gives you an example of knowledge and how you move through the world in these actual situations, the application of it, as opposed to just the data and information that could be represented in a new object, right? That's just data and information. But who you are and how you move through the world, how you respond to all these things, that's when you enter the knowledge and the wisdom component.
There is an element of this as well that projects, just like introverted intuition or perspectives, and says, oh, I know what's going on. I see the pattern, and I'm going to project that outward. And this, combined with the speed of the process itself, how fast this process likes to make connections, one of the things as an ESJ that you can do is just to slow down, to respect this, to say, yes, I can rely upon this in some ways to see patterns, but if I move too fast, I'll make connections too quickly, and then I'll project those connections onto the reality. And again, you can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can create a situation where you're steering towards something you quote unquote see, or the connections and the intuition you're pulling in. How accurate is that though? Have you slowed down to check with yourself to say, what do I actually know about this situation or this person or this experience? Not just the quick pattern I'm making, but what can I really dig into to know about this? And that's where you can get into your co-pilot or auxiliary function of introverted sensing, resting again into the things that are knowable. Who have you been over time? Use that to slow yourself down so you don't use this advanced pattern recognition of extroverted intuition, exploration, to move too fast through the world.
Yeah, or be too optimistic. In some ways, with introverted intuition or perspectives with ISPs, this can sometimes make them a little cynical, right? They can feel like they're the only ones who are seeing the real pattern, and other people's patterns can't be trusted. And so sometimes it can make them lean back. For ESJs with this function as a 10-year-old or tertiary, extroverted intuition tends to be very optimistic. It can see how it could be. And so sometimes ESJs will run into a situation too quickly because they see how it could be, all the possibilities.
Like a relationship maybe or something.
Exactly, or a business opportunity or something to that effect. And so understanding that this is not just opportunistic. This is, again, an opportunity to grow, to change, to become something different than you knew before. Now, of course, sometimes running into the wrong relationship will teach you buckets about who you are. But then the purpose, of course, is to take that wisdom for the future. You don't want to just keep running into relationships, particularly bad ones, just to learn more about yourself. You want to gain that wisdom over time and go, maybe I'll give that one a pass, because now you're seeing the real patterns, the underlying patterns of the situation, not just the optimistic what if question.
All right, now as we move from the two intuitive 10-year-old or tertiary processes, we're going to move over to the sensing 10-year-old or tertiary process, introverted sensing and extroverted sensing. So let's start with extroverted sensing. We've nicknamed it sensation. This is used by all ENJs in the Myers-Briggs system. So ENFJs and ENTJs use this as their 10-year-old or tertiary process.
Extroverted sensing or sensation's purpose in existing, the reason why we must have it, all of us, regardless of our type, is that it understands the purpose of presence, being in the moment, experiencing the world as it is, right here, right now.
From one single perspective.
That's right. And the reason why that's so important is because if we don't have that to tap into, we might be there, but we're not there. We're not experiencing the aliveness of the situation or the moment. If we're never present, What was the purpose of being around to begin with? If we're always experiencing things inside of ourselves, inside our heads, or if we're always experiencing things on a conceptual level, if we can never just take a moment and allow time to stand still for a second and be in that situation, then we're not really ever experiencing aliveness. So extroverted sensing or sensation, it teaches us to be here right now, to be in the moment. And when you have this as a 10-year-old or tertiary, part of what comes along with presence is being associated with your body, being associated with the importance of taking action. If you don't have a future, if the future doesn't really exist for you when you're present, then anything that needs to be done right now. It has to be done right now. And there's a lot of value to that. But when you have it as a 10-year-old or tertiary, sometimes you get so caught up in the having to do right now that you separate it from the purpose of presence. And you just get caught up in perpetual activity, particularly since this is going to be associated with an extroverted judging function, like extroverted thinking for ENTJs and extroverted feeling for ENFJs. There's this idea that I have to get all this done and I have to get it done now. And weirdly enough, it almost does a 360 in this idea of constantly and perpetually being in action. It's a go, go, go fixation almost, that being in action strips you the ability to be present. There's like no moment of just slowing down. There's no moment of associating with what is going on in the moment. What happens when you associate with the moment is you also associate with yourself experiencing the moment. So it forces you to also tap into your body. What is your body experiencing? That's the instrument that is experiencing all these senses. So you must tap into your body. And when an ENJ really truly respects the purpose of this function, they make sure that they're not just a human doing, they're a human being, right? That they're in the present moment. They're experiencing a sense of aliveness. They're feeling the wind through their hair and they're feeling all the tactile experiences. And at the same time, they're honoring the instrument that's experiencing all of that, which is the body. They have a way to make sure that their body isn't just tapped into pleasure or tapped into, like the pleasurable experiences of the senses, but that they're tapped into the need to hone those experiences as a better instrument. So they have a mind-body practice generally. They're not just go, go, go. They don't get caught up in this need to perpetually being, doing, that they understand the value of slowing down. They understand the value of being tapped into what is happening right now in the real, not just caught up in whatever's happening inside their minds.
I think the other thing here too is when you're moving so fast, you miss details. You would think that this function, because it's so present to the moment or observing things, can pick up details and observe them, and it can, but only when it's being present, right? So you can't do it when you're moving too fast to observe those details. And I've seen a lot of ENJs miss things that, to me, and details are hard for me too, but I'm like, how did you not see that? Well, they're moving so quickly to close loops or get things accomplished or connect with that person that they're missing those things. So I think this also can hijack you by, you'll make mistakes. You may not have things, dialed in on the precision level. You're just grossly kind of oversimplifying them or getting them done quickly, but you're not doing them with precision or attention to detail.
Right. This is almost like a photo negative of the ISP situation, where you want to use your 10-year-old or tertiary of introverted intuition or perspectives as a helper for extroverted sensing or sensation. You want to be moving through the world and then using your intuition to help you navigate better, faster, a little bit more nimble, make the right choices as you're in motion. On the flip side, extroverted sensing as a 10-year-old or tertiary encourages ENJs to move too fast, to constantly be in motion. And like you said, it misses all of that texture. But if you're using this as a helper for your introverted intuition or perspectives, it means when you're going inside of your intuition, you'll have much richer information to feed to it because you have been paying attention to the outside world. You can create better inner realities, better landscapes as you're running simulations because you've been paying attention to how things are actually unfolding in the outside world through that presence. So again, it's almost like to call the best wisdom from your 10-year-old or tertiary is to be aware of its purpose in existing and then kick that all the information it understands, all the data and information up to your co-pilot or auxiliary to then really get the juice out of it, really get that knowledge and wisdom, because that's actually the place where you're going to have the most knowledge and wisdom is in your auxiliary or co-pilot. That's your perceiving function that does the best assessment, right? However that looks. So really, I guess one could argue that in order to have true knowledge and wisdom, you take the data and information that's from your 10-year-old or tertiary, and then you send it up to your co-pilot or auxiliary to really determine how best to use this. It's a helper or guide. And for ESJs, it's, like you said, being a little bit more present-oriented, being a little bit more understanding how things are actually rolling out in reality, and then putting it up to the intuition to then help it run better simulations and see things with greater foresight because you actually experienced them. You actually saw how something happened in the real world, and your intuition is now better at running a simulation for a similar situation.
All right, let's wrap up today by talking about introverted sensing. We've nicknamed this memory. This is the 10-year-old or tertiary process of all INPs, INTPs, and INFPs. I just said all of them again. It was only two.
You've done it every time.
Now I'm like self-conscious about it. Like, wait a minute, all of it. There's only two, and I've got to think it through.
You've done it every time. It's so funny because every time you do it, I'm like, oh, I'm such an idiot for calling them out before. And now I've made you self-conscious.
No, I stop for a minute. I'm like checking with my own brain. Like I say stuff out loud and I'm like, wait, am I saying that accurately? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, right.
It's true. All of them. Of the 7 to 8 billion people on the planet that happen to be INPs, all of them will be using this as a 10-year-old tertiary. Totally right. You're totally right. So let's talk about what the purpose of introverted sensing or memory is, or one of its major purposes that INPs need to have respect for. One could argue that the purpose of introverted sensing or memory is to honor what has been, the wisdom that has already been called, effectively tracking, right? Introverted sensing or memory is a tracking function. It sees everything as it has been in the past. Now, it might have somewhat of a bias towards how it impacted the person using it personally, right? Like what it meant to them as an individual and who they become based on that. But it's still tracking all of the things that have come before, all of these experiences that have meaning to that person. And when an INP really respects this, it means that they will be tracking who they are and how they've changed over time. Again, like going back to what we talked about, the knowledge and wisdom means it's the information is being kicked up to the co-pilot or the auxiliary. And we've already talked about extroverted intuition or exploration as being something that understands the purpose of change and how it impacts us as individuals. Like we grow through all of this change. But if we don't track our growth, if we don't track our progress, we don't get the benefit of seeing how important it is to go out into the world and engage in things outside of our comfort zone. It lacks the meaning of all of that change. Introverted sensing or memory helps us reattach to the meaning of all of the different experiences we've had and how it's changed us as individuals and who we've become over time. Now, unfortunately, what happens with some INPs is that they get lost in the past or get lost in what has been. They get a little too associated with the comfort of the past, and they don't really want new things. They don't really want to be changed. In fact, sometimes INPs will get this attitude, sort of an ego or pride around who they are and not wanting to be changed.
You know, you were just watching a movie recently, Antonia, of a character. I can't remember the guy's name. We don't know his type, but let's just pretend like he's an INFP. At least from a character standpoint, he had hit fame by being a writer. And he was really struggling in this movie around this new role that was being thrust upon him. And he's like, no, that's not who I am. I'm not a writer. I'm not this big, giant, popular writer. I just want to be the regular guy. And that's my identity. I don't want to change and adapt to this new reality that's coming my direction. I think that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Like all of a sudden you have a role or something that's different that requires something different of you. And you fight to hold on to what has been rather than altering the way you do things for the future.
Well, and knowing that change over time is inevitable, and it doesn't mean that you don't still have those qualities of who you were from before. Like there's value in tracking all of this progress and not getting so caught up in what has been that there's no progress to track.
Yeah. And I think the has been for INPs, for INFPs, it's this little circle around their identity that they can say, this is who I am. I have the boundaries and borders. I know myself and I know what I am all about. And for, I think, INTPs, it's, I have mastered thought in these areas. I have competency here. And if I expand that circle out to maybe areas I'm not so certain of, I'm going to look incompetent, and I don't want to do that either. So it's a protection for the competency for, I think, INTPs and the identity for INFPs.
Exactly. And so, again, photo negatives for ESJs, extroverted intuition or exploration should be recognizing that new experiences need to be kicked up to your introverted sensing or memory in order to track how these changes have impacted and affect you, and not getting too obsessed with just the feeling of something new or novel, but actually experiencing something that is new and novel that has an impact on who you are as an individual. For INPs, it's basically the opposite. It's recognizing that your introverted sensing or memory helps you track your changes as well. It's not getting too caught up in the sameness of it or just experiencing the same thing over and over in order to hold on to your identity, but actually use it as a helper so that as you change, you can watch yourself change over time, and it will help you be more bold. Extroverted intuition or exploration is very similar to extroverted sensing. It's a part of us that has a boldness to it. For extroverted sensing or sensation, it's about taking action without putting too much thought into it, right? Why belabor it? Why have to think about it all day? Like, this is the thing that's in front of me. I'm going to go do it. I'm going to go experience life. I'm going to have max aliveness. I'm going to be present to it. And as I go, I'm going to trust that I'll be able to navigate my way through, have some intuition in there that helps me make the right choices as I'm in motion. For extroverted intuition, it's I'm going to have the boldness to change. I'm going to have the boldness to do, things outside of my comfort zone. And I recognize, or I have the faith in myself that over time, I'll track all of these things and see how I've changed as an individual. I'll use my introverted sensing or memory as a guide to make sure that as I'm making these bold endeavors, that I have a part of me that also is grounded and realistic and remembers who I was before and honors that enough to be able to make really good choices in my boldness as well there too. So I think with all of this is, just like, I don't know if we talked about this much last week about the polarity portion.
Yeah.
But it's really important to remember that knowledge and wisdom with these perceiving functions comes from marrying the two sides of these polarities. No matter what type you are, if you're using extroverted sensing, introverted intuition, and combining these two things in the proper dynamic is how you're going to get to knowledge and wisdom, not just data and information. And the same thing with extroverted intuition and introverted sensing. It's the whole package that is required for knowledge and wisdom, but only if you do it in the right order. If you are an ISP, you want to start with extroverted sensing and then have introverted intuition be a helper so you can get to that knowledge and wisdom. If you're an ENJ, you want to be primarily focused on your introverted intuition or perspectives, but then use extroverted sensing or sensation as a helper for it to be able to make sure that the simulations you're running are textured and grounded in reality and the things you've actually seen and experienced. For INPs, you want to be using your extroverted intuition as boldness, as something that really helps you explore the world, but then you want to supplement it with introverted sensing or memory in order to make better, really good decisions about the bold action you're going to take, but also track over time how these new experiences have changed you and how you've grown and who you've become, and not resist that. And then if you are an ESJ, you want to be primarily using introverted sensing or memory to stretch out timelines, not take actions too quickly, but then use extroverted intuition or exploration as a way to not just seek novelty, but seek situations that help you grow over time, right? Like gets you out of your comfort zone and make sure that you're doing the things that won't just be new hits, right? Quick hits, but things that really help facilitate your growth and development.
So as we wrap up this two-part series, have you noticed the what crosses you supports you framework here, right? It's kind of hard to get a hold of at this 10-year-old tertiary level because the things that are really great about the functions are also the things that hinder us at this placement in the CAR model or the cognitive function stack. What crosses us at the 10-year-old or tertiary supports us, and what supports us crosses us. So this is some tough stuff to get our hands around. And the other thing is we overvalue our 10-year-old or tertiary process. We all think we're better at it than we are. I mean, I do. I think I'm better at it than I actually am. And we all have that experience. So this is a really persnickety function, and we've seen so much growth come from having it serve the co-pilot or auxiliary function in your personality. If there's only one message you take away from all the personality hacker material and podcasts and recordings and courses that we have, it's start with the co-pilot. That auxiliary co-pilot process, growing that is one of the best places to start in your personality because it puts that 10-year-old or tertiary in the proper perspective. It puts it in its proper place of serving that co-pilot rather than the co-pilot serving that 10-year-old. So as we wrap up, what do you think? What experiences have you had in your life? We've gone through all of the types now, all of the 10-year-old or tertiary positions. Which one do you use, and what is your story around it? You haven't had a microphone, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, make your voice heard and share your story with us so we know what your experience has been.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and a review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. If you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And we have a suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. So if that sounds interesting to you, go check that out at personalityhacker.com under our product page. If you've been struggling to figure out your personality type, one of the services we offer is a consultation with one of our profiling consultants. So if that's interesting to you, you can check that out on the product page as well.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.